Today we delve into Project Mercury, America's first human spaceflight program.
A fascinating period indeed.
We're in the midst of the Cold War, the space race is heating up, and the U.S. is under immense pressure to catch up with the Soviet Union.
The Soviets had, shall we say, a head start.
They did rather, with Sputnik and Gagarin. But Project Mercury aimed to put an American in orbit and bring him back safely.
A bold objective.
It certainly was. We have a wealth of sources to explore: declassified documents, astronaut biographies.
Remarkable insights into this era of pioneering space exploration. It truly captures the challenges and triumphs of Project Mercury.
What particularly struck me is how the program, arising from the newly formed NASA, adopted this resourceful can-do approach.
Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. The Space Task Group, formed within NASA, had to think creatively.
So they weren't waiting for brand new technologies to emerge.
No, not at all. They cleverly adapted existing technologies, like modified Redstone and Atlas missiles, for instance.
That pragmatic approach seems to be a hallmark of Project Mercury.
Pragmatism driven by the urgency of the Cold War rivalry.
Absolutely. But beyond just outdoing the Soviets, what were the core aims of Project Mercury?
Demonstrating American capability in space was, of course, a key factor, but there was a crucial scientific element, too.
To understand how humans would actually cope in space.
Precisely. Could pilots function effectively in weightlessness? Could they withstand the intense G-forces of launch and re-entry? These were unknowns with significant implications.
And so began the search for those who would face these unknowns. The Mercury 7.
Whittled down from an initial 508 candidates, these 7 test pilots, the absolute elite,
An elite group indeed.
subjected to a barrage of grueling physical and mental tests, designed to push them to the very edge of human endurance.
I read about extreme temperatures, isolation chambers. It sounds absolutely grueling.
It was designed to select only the most resilient individuals, those capable of withstanding the rigors of space travel.
And even figures like Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier, didn't make the cut.
His lack of a college degree was a disqualifying factor at that time. Even Neil Armstrong, who was the civilian test pilot then, was initially rejected.
A rather different trajectory history might have taken.
Indeed. Those selection criteria underscore the initial focus on military personnel.
Let's shift our focus now to the Mercury spacecraft itself. It was, shall we say, compact.
Compact is one way to put it. The cone-shaped capsule was strikingly small, designed purely to transport an astronaut to orbit and back safely.
I imagine it was a rather snug fit.
Snug indeed. The interior, with its 120 controls, custom-molded seat, and the astronaut positioned on his back facing the heat shield, presented a unique set of challenges.
Quite a contrast to the comparatively spacious vehicles we see today. What's intriguing is the astronauts' insistence on having manual controls and a window.
Features that some engineers considered unnecessary?
You would think they would be essential.
And indeed, these features proved vital in later missions. John Glenn's experience on Mercury Atlas 6, where a malfunctioning automatic control system forced him to take manual control, highlights this perfectly.
A testament to the astronauts' training and their ability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances.
Absolutely. They were far more than just passengers.
Now, on to the launch vehicles that powered these missions.
The Redstone rocket, a modified version of the German V2, was employed for suborbital flights. For orbital missions, they used the more powerful Atlas missile.
And let's not forget the aptly named Little Joe.
Ah, yes, Little Joe, a smaller rocket crucial for testing the launch escape system.
It seems every component was meticulously tested, underlining the inherent risks involved. Shall we dive into the missions themselves?
By all means, let's follow the timeline.
Excellent. So on 5 May 1961, we have Alan Shepard aboard Freedom 7, becoming the first American in space.
A suborbital flight lasting just 15 minutes, but a monumental achievement nonetheless.
Although it didn't achieve orbit like Yuri Gagarin's flight a few weeks prior.
True, but still a significant step for the American space program.
It wasn't without his hiccups, though.
Ah, yes. The infamous bathroom break incident.
A rather delicate subject.
Launch delays left Shepard in the capsule for longer than anticipated.
And the lack of a urine collection system at that stage led to, well,
an unplanned event.
An important, if somewhat uncomfortable, lesson learned. Next, we have Gus Grissom's flight aboard Liberty Bell 7 on 21 July 1961.
Another suborbital venture, and one that ended rather dramatically.
Indeed, Grissom's flight went smoothly until splashdown when the explosive hatch prematurely blew open,
flooding the capsule and forcing Grissom to make a rather hasty exit.
He maintained he hadn't touched the hatch release.
But suspicion lingered until Wally Schirra accidentally triggered the hatch on a later flight, receiving a bruise in the process. Only then was Grissom exonerated.
A rather unfortunate sequence of events, but one that ultimately led to crucial safety improvements. Then, on 20 February 1962, John Glenn, aboard Friendship 7, etched his name in history,
becoming the first American to orbit the Earth, a pivotal moment in the space race.
He completed 3 orbits in just under 5 hours.
A remarkable feat, especially considering he faced some technical difficulties. His automatic control system malfunctioned, highlighting the importance of the astronaut's piloting skills. Then there was the concern about the heat shield. A faulty sensor suggested it might have come loose.
A rather nail-biting moment, I imagine.
Absolutely. Mission Control decided to keep the retro rocket pack attached during re-entry, hoping it would secure the heat shield.
A calculated risk.
Indeed. Thankfully, the shield held and Glenn returned safely. A testament to human ingenuity and a good measure of luck. Next, we have Scott Carpenter piloting Aurora 7 on 24 May 1962, a mission with a focus on scientific experimentation. Carpenter conducted experiments on liquids and weightlessness and attempted to observe a ground-based flare.
And he inadvertently solved the mystery of John Glenn's fireflies.
Quite right. He realized that ice particles, frozen condensation from the spacecraft's cooling system, were dislodged when he bumped the cabin wall, explaining Glenn's observations.
A serendipitous discovery. But this mission, too, had a rather dramatic conclusion.
Fuel management and attitude control problems led to Carpenter landing significantly off course,
delaying recovery and resulting in some criticism of his performance.
Despite the mission's overall success,
these early missions highlight the unpredictable nature of space travel
and the steep learning curve involved.
Moving on to Wally Schirra's flight aboard Sigma 7 on 3 October 1962. Here we see a shift in focus towards endurance and piloting proficiency.
After the issues on Carpenter's flight, the emphasis was on proving the reliability of both the spacecraft and the astronauts' ability to handle longer missions.
So it was about demonstrating that they had learned from those previous experiences.
Precisely. Schirra, spending over 9 hours in orbit and completing 6 orbits, successfully demonstrated both.
And his accidental triggering of the explosive hatch, while startling, served to exonerate Grissom.
An unintended but valuable outcome.
The final act of Project Mercury was Gordon Cooper's flight aboard Faith 7, launched on 15 May 1963.
A truly remarkable flight. Cooper spent a record-breaking 34 hours in space, completing 22 orbits.
More than double the duration of any previous American mission.
This feat proved the feasibility of extended spaceflight, paving the way for the longer missions of Gemini and Apollo.
A fitting culmination to Project Mercury.
Indeed, a testament to how far they had come in just a few short years.
Before we delve deeper into the specifics of those missions, let's acknowledge the vital role of ground control and the extensive tracking network.
Absolutely. The success of Project Mercury was as much about the team on the ground as the astronauts in space.
Those images of mission control are iconic, but they only reveal a small part of the story.
The manned spaceflight network, a technological marvel of its time, enabled continuous communication with the spacecraft, tracking stations on ships, planes, and land-based locations across the globe.
Maintaining communication throughout the mission must have been incredibly challenging, particularly in those early days of computing and satellite communication.
It was a logistical and technical feat, requiring extraordinary coordination and expertise.
Quite a remarkable undertaking, really, when you consider the technological constraints of the time. Imagine tracking this tiny capsule, hurtling around the Earth using 1960s computers. Must have been quite a feat.
It certainly pushed the boundaries of what was then achievable. We mustn't forget, these astronauts were pioneers venturing into the unknown, strapped into what amounted to a sophisticated tin can. Their courage was extraordinary.
And those tin cans, the Mercury spacecraft, they underwent a bit of an evolution in design, didn't they? A few hiccups along the way.
Yes, indeed. The initial design, Configuration C, I believe it was called, well, it failed a test flight in 1959. Turned out the airframe was simply too fragile. Couldn't withstand the stresses of flight.
So, back to the drawing board.
Precisely. They reinforced the structure, creating Configuration D, which became the blueprint for all the subsequent Mercury capsules. Shows their adaptability, doesn't it? refining the design even as the program was underway.
And then there was the heat shield, absolutely critical, of course, for the astronauts' survival during re-entry.
Vital. Initially, they considered a heat sink, to absorb the heat, but ultimately, they opted for an ablative shield.
For those of us less familiar with the technical jargon, could you perhaps elaborate on what an ablative shield is?
Certainly. It's designed to burn away in a controlled manner during re-entry, you see, dissipating the intense heat generated by atmospheric friction, directing it away from the spacecraft, essentially a sacrificial layer that protects the capsule and the astronaut inside. They tested various materials and shapes rigorously, wind tunnels, even ballistic missile flights, all to ensure it would be effective.
So that iconic image, the Mercury capsule glowing red hot during re-entry, that's the ablative shield doing its job.
Exactly. A visual testament to the extreme conditions these missions had to endure.
And then we have the launch escape system, that rather striking tower on top of the capsule. What was its purpose?
Safety. Purely for safety. Designed to safeguard the astronaut should a launch failure occur. A very real possibility with the rockets of that era. In an emergency, it would fire, pulling the capsule away from the malfunctioning rocket. Then deploy parachutes for a safe landing.
A crucial safety net, given the inherent risks.
Absolutely.
And it's here that little Joe, that rather endearingly named test rocket, comes into the picture.
Precisely. Little Joe played a key role in testing the launch escape system at various altitudes and speeds, ensuring it would function reliably if ever needed.
Thankfully, it was never required during a crewed flight. But even with all these safety precautions in place, those early missions must have been incredibly daunting for the astronauts. To be strapped into that tiny capsule, knowing all the things that could go wrong.
Oh, undoubtedly. These weren't pleasure cruises. They were pushing the boundaries of human endeavor. And those astronauts were fully aware of the dangers.
And yet, the sources reveal this incredible sense of dedication, a thirst for exploration that drove them on. They knew they were making history with every step they took.
A shared sense of purpose, don't you think? Not just among the astronauts, but everyone involved. Engineers, technicians, medical staff, all part of this collective effort, this determination to succeed.
That can-do attitude, it seems to be a hallmark of early American space exploration. But it wasn't just about national pride or one-upmanship with the Soviets. There was this genuine scientific curiosity, this desire to expand our understanding of the cosmos.
Project Mercury laid the groundwork for everything that followed, demonstrated that human spaceflight was possible, that we could not only survive, but function in the harsh environment of space. A giant leap forward, really, made possible by those courageous individuals in their, well, seemingly fragile capsules.
And those capsules serve as quite a stark reminder of how far we've come. Reading about the cramped interior of a Mercury spacecraft, it's hard to imagine spending any significant time in such confined quarters.
The astronaut had barely more room than in a small car, really. Strapped into this custom-molded seat, lying on his back, surrounded by instruments and controls. A testament to their resilience, wouldn't you say?
And they didn't even have a proper toilet in the early models.
No, they didn't. The need for, shall we say, bathroom breaks wasn't fully anticipated for those initial suborbital flights. Alan Shepard's rather predicament on the launch pad, a consequence of those launch delays, highlighted this oversight.
A slightly embarrassing situation, but one that spurred the development of a more practical solution.
Indeed. For the later, longer missions, they introduced a rudimentary urine collection system, though a far cry from the sophisticated waste management systems we have today.
One imagines it wasn't the most pleasant aspect of space travel, but then I suppose comfort comes second to making history. Now, before we delve into the later missions, I think it's worth mentioning the chimpanzee flights. Quite controversial even at the time.
The use of animals in spaceflight, it's always been a sensitive issue. But in the context of the time, it was deemed necessary to gather data before risking human lives. They needed to understand how living beings would react. The weightlessness, the G-forces, the radiation.
So Ham and Enos, the two chimpanzees who flew on Mercury missions, they were paving the way for the human astronauts.
In a sense, yes. Their flights provided invaluable data on the physiological effects of space travel. Ham's journey aboard Mercury Redstone 2, for instance, though not without its technical glitches, revealed the importance of a robust environmental control system.
His flight experienced an over-acceleration during launch, and a cabin pressure drop, if I'm not mistaken.
You're quite right. It speaks volumes about the resilience of these animals, that they could withstand such stresses. And then there was Enos, who flew aboard Mercury Atlas 5, the final test flight before John Glenn's orbital mission.
Enos's flight was designed to assess his ability to perform tasks, wasn't it? Responding to light signals.
Yes, his performance was closely monitored throughout the mission. Unfortunately, there was a malfunction. With the reward and punishment system during his task training, he received a number of unintended electric shocks.
Rather unfortunate incident. Thankfully, it didn't have any lasting consequences for Enos. These chimpanzee flights, despite the controversy, they played a significant role in paving the way for the first American orbital mission, John Glenn's historic flight aboard Friendship 7.
A pivotal moment captured the world's attention, marked a turning point in the space race. But as we've seen, even Glenn's mission had its fair share of challenges.
The heat shield concern, the need for manual control, a reminder that spaceflight, even with meticulous planning and preparation, inherently risky, a real testament to the skill and the courage of those early astronauts, and the ingenuity of the team supporting them. That they were able to overcome these obstacles. Shall we explore those later missions in more detail? We were just discussing the inherent risks and challenges of early spaceflight, but it wasn't all nail-biting tension and technical glitches, was it? The sources we've looked at suggest a certain spirit of adventure, even, dare I say, a touch of humor amidst these pioneering missions.
Yes, quite. The early days of space exploration, well, they were marked by a remarkable degree of improvisation and a willingness to, let's say, bend the rules a bit. They were venturing into uncharted territory, after all. Both the engineers and the astronauts had to think on their feet, come up with ingenious solutions to some rather unique problems.
Take the astronaut training, for example. It wasn't just a matter of physical fitness and the right stuff.
Oh, not at all. The Mercury astronauts were subjected to a whole battery of grueling tests, centrifuges, altitude chambers, even underwater simulations. And to prepare for the sensory deprivation of space, they spent time in isolation tanks. Rather disconcerting, one imagines.
I can't imagine it would be a particularly enjoyable experience.
No. And yet, alongside this cutting-edge technology, they also employed some surprisingly low-tech training methods. I read about them using a playground roundabout, of all things.
A roundabout?
Yes, the human centrifuge, as it was affectionately known. They'd strap themselves into a chair mounted on a roundabout and have someone spin them around to simulate the G-forces experienced during launch and re-entry.
Remarkably resourceful. And what about simulating weightlessness?
One method involved flying parabolic trajectories in a large aircraft, creating brief periods of weightlessness. It's a technique still used today, often referred to as the vomit comet, for reasons which become apparent during the flight.
I can imagine. Space sickness was a significant issue on those early missions, wasn't it? How did they address that, aside from perhaps copious amounts of ginger ale?
Medication was developed to alleviate the symptoms, but it was also a process of adaptation, really. Learning to cope with the unfamiliar sensations of prolonged weightlessness. As they gained more experience, the severity tended to decrease.
Those early astronauts were real trailblazers, weren't they? Paving the way for all who followed. Speaking of which, we haven't mentioned Deke Slayton, the, shall we say, unlucky member of the Mercury 7.
Yes, a rather unfortunate turn of events for Slayton. Grounded due to an irregular heartbeat, just months before his scheduled flight. A bitter disappointment. But he went on to play a crucial role in the astronaut office, selecting and training future astronauts for the Gemini and Apollo programs. Became known as the chief astronaut, in fact.
And his story does have a happy ending. He finally got his chance to venture into space in 1975 as part of the Apollo-Soyuz test project.
A fitting culmination to a remarkable career.
It really is. What strikes me, looking back at Project Mercury, is that despite the setbacks, the technical challenges, the inherent risks, there was this pervasive sense of, well, fun, of adventure, a certain swagger that these pioneers exuded.
They were pushing the boundaries of human experience, and they did so with, well, a remarkable spirit of optimism, I'd say. And this sense of wonder wasn't confined to the astronauts and their support teams. The Mercury missions captured the world's imagination.
People were glued to their radios and their televisions, following every launch, every orbit, every splashdown. It was a time of great hope, wasn't it? This belief that anything was possible.
Project Mercury symbolized that hope, that ambition. It wasn't simply about reaching for the stars. It was about pushing the limits of human ingenuity, of technological innovation, the advancements that were sparked by Project Mercury. In fields like computing, communications, material science, they had a profound impact far beyond the realm of space exploration.
A catalyst for progress in so many ways, and that legacy continues to this day. Every rocket launch, every satellite image of our planet, it's a reminder of those early missions, those courageous individuals who dared to venture into the unknown.
Project Mercury is a testament, wouldn't you say, to the power of human endeavor. A demonstration that, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, well, ingenuity, determination, and a bit of good humor can prevail. It's a story that continues to inspire, to explore, to discover, to reach for the stars.
A fitting sentiment to conclude our deep dive into Project Mercury. It's been a fascinating journey through a truly pivotal chapter in human history. As always, though, we like to leave you with a thought to ponder. Considering the limitations of the technology at the time, what aspect of Project Mercury do you find most impressive? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring, keep discovering, and keep looking up at the stars. Well, then ready to dive into a pretty big moment, a turning point, really, in, well, space history. Today, we're zeroing in on Mercury Redstone 3, better known, I think, as Freedom 7. It was America's first crewed spaceflight back on May 5th, 1961, with Alan Shepard at the controls.
Absolutely. And it's worth remembering, for our listener, the core aim. The U.S. wanted to prove Shepard could handle the intense stresses of a suborbital flight and really thoroughly test the Mercury capsule systems, you see. Of course, the grand goal of Project Mercury, the big one, was always to get into orbit.
Exactly. And you can't talk about Freedom 7 without the backdrop of, well, the space race. The Soviets had already pulled off an orbital flight, hadn't they, with Yuri Gagarin. So for America, this was suborbital, sure, but there was a lot riding on it.
Oh, without a doubt. And that suborbital aspect, it's key. Freedom 7 reached space, yes, but didn't have the oomph, the velocity, for a proper orbit. Think of it as a stepping stone, a vital one, even if it was a shorter hop. It was paving the way, laying the groundwork for those later orbital missions.
For this deep dive, we've got quite the pile of material. We have mission notes, capsule specifics, a timeline of events, bios for the main players, a briefing document, even a study guide. Our goal as always is to go through it all and pick out the most important bits, the interesting bits, for you. So where should we begin? The spacecraft itself, perhaps?
A sensible place to start. Mercury capsule number 7. A bit of a plain name at first, wasn't it? Arrived at Cape Canaveral, December 9th, 1960.
And even though other capsules were available, weren't they? The decision was made to wait for number 7 specifically. Why was that?
Yes, there were others. But number 7 had been earmarked way back in the summer of '60, you see. It was intended for this, the first crewed flight. But when it arrived, well, it was clear that a lot of development, a lot of testing was still needed. It wasn't quite ready for a human passenger. But the choice to stick with it, despite the delays, it shows how vital this capsule was to the program, especially in those early stages.
A sign of thoroughness, then, would you say? And then, of course, Shepard came along and named it Freedom 7. A rather fitting name, I'd say.
Quite right. Shepard believed in following tradition, pilots naming their aircraft. He discussed it with his wife Louise, with John Glenn, the backup pilot, and with Robert Gilruth, the head of the Mercury program. And they all approved.
Now, about that 7 in Freedom 7, a lot of people get that wrong, don't they? It wasn't about the 7 Mercury astronauts themselves.
No, not directly. The 7 actually refers to the McDonnell model number 7. That was the factory designation for Shepard's spacecraft, you see, in the Mercury program. However, the number resonated, you could say, with the other astronauts. They liked the symbolism. So they started adding 7 to their spacecraft names as well. So Shepard, without meaning to, started a trend. First, that Mercury spacecraft would have names, and second, what those names would be like.
And it was the Mercury Redstone launch vehicle, wasn't it, that lifted Freedom 7 off the ground?
That's right, the Mercury Redstone, a vital piece of engineering. And speaking of thoroughness, they were quite careful with that launch vehicle as well. There were worries about its reliability, weren't there? Especially after the MR2 test flight, the one with Ham the chimp.
Ah, yes, Ham's flight. Didn't quite go as planned, did it? Higher G-forces than they expected, the flight went on longer, and recovering the capsule was a bit of a struggle, if I remember correctly.
You're absolutely right. The MR2 flight ran into some hiccups. The flight went a bit off script, ended up going further and faster than intended. Ham had to endure more G-force than planned. And landing! Well, the capsule landed miles away from where it was supposed to. It took them ages to retrieve it. So naturally, people began to question if the Redstone was really up to the job, ready for a human passenger.
And so, very sensibly, they added another test flight. Uncrewed this time. MRBD, wasn't it? Booster Development Flight, I think they called it.
Precisely. NASA decided to do another test without a crew to look closely at the Redstone booster to address those worries that cropped up after MR2. This MRBD flight, they launched it in late March of '61, went pretty smoothly, instilled more confidence, that the vehicle was ready for a crewed mission. Of course, this extra testing pushed back the MR3 timeline. The original plan was for March. But you see, this whole episode demonstrated how important it was to test and test again. They took the data from each flight, used it to tweak the systems, make them more reliable. It wasn't just about getting someone into space, it was about getting them there safely, minimizing the risks as much as possible.
Then there's Alan Shepard's selection as the pilot. That was decided quite a while before the actual launch, wasn't it?
It was. Robert Gilruth chose Shepard in early January '61. John Glenn and Gus Grissom were his backups. But cleverly, they held back on announcing Shepard as the pilot. They waited till much closer to launch day. Gilruth wanted to be able to change things up if needed at the last minute. Maybe a bit cautious, but it shows the immense pressure, the scrutiny on this first crewed flight. And the selection itself, it was rigorous. Medical checks, psychological evaluations, and of course their experience as test pilots. All these early Mercury flights, even the unmanned ones, the ones with animals, they all added to the data pool, helped them understand how humans would react in space. It shaped how they picked and trained astronauts for future missions.
Now, launch day itself, May 5th. There was, a bit of drama, wasn't there? I seem to recall a few delays.
That's putting it mildly. They tried to launch on May 2nd, but bad weather put a stop to it just over 2 hours before liftoff. Shepard was already suited up, ready to go. Then the next attempt, May 4th, same story, bad weather, postponed again. Finally, on the 5th, even though the weather was better, more delays, cloud cover was iffy, then a power unit played up, and they even had to reboot a computer at Goddard Space Flight Center. All these hiccups, they really highlight how complicated space launches are. So many things, the environment, the technology, everything has to be perfect, completely aligned, every hold, every issue. The engineers and mission control analyzed it all, used it to refine the launch process, learn for the future.
And all that meant Shepard was stuck in the capsule for quite a while before finally getting off the ground.
Absolutely. He climbed into Freedom 7 at 5:15 a.m. Eastern Time. Scheduled launch was 7:20 a.m. But those holds, those technical issues, meant he was cooped up in that spacecraft for almost 3 hours. Imagine the willpower it took to sit there, waiting, strapped in, knowing the risks. Those early missions, they weren't just about technology. They tested human endurance, how people react under pressure. And monitoring Shepard during those delays, that gave them valuable data, helped them understand the stress astronauts would face.
And of course, there was that, memorable incident. Shepard needed to relieve himself. Quite a pressing matter, given the delays.
A very human moment in all the high tech. Now, they expected the mission to be short, under 20 minutes, so the Mercury suit didn't have any, urine collection system. But with the delays, Shepard had to tell the crew he needed to go. At first, they said no. Opening the hatch was too complicated, would take too long. But Shepard insisted. In the end, they switched off the power to his medical sensors, and he had to relieve himself inside the suit. Maybe not very dignified, but it shows you that these pioneers, they were human after all, and it probably made them rethink the toilet situation for future space flights. You can't ignore basic human needs, even in space.
Right. Well, let's move on to the flight itself, suborbital, as we've said. Can you walk us through the main events, the timings?
Certainly. So liftoff, 00.00 on the mission clock. At 00.24, the Redstone started its pitch program, putting the spacecraft on the right path. 01.24, maximum dynamic pressure, what they call max Q. It's the point where the aerodynamic forces on the vehicle are at their peak. Booster engine cutoff, or BECO, happened at 02.2. Freedom 7 had reached its suborbital velocity by then. 2 seconds later, at 02.22, they jettisoned the escape tower, no longer needed. And then at 02.24, spacecraft separation from the booster using posigrade rockets. By 02.35, the automatic attitude control system started turning the capsule around, putting the heat shield forward, ready for reentry. And at that point, 02.35, Alan Shepard took over manual control. He was testing how the spacecraft handled. This was crucial. Allowed Shepard to give direct feedback on how responsive and stable the capsule was. Vital data for tweaking the controls for future Mercury missions and beyond.
And how did he find the manual controls? I believe there's a comparison to the simulator.
Yes, Shepard said the response felt broadly similar to the Mercury simulator, but there was a difference. He couldn't actually hear the control jets firing during the flight, unlike in the simulator. Too much background noise inside the capsule. This highlights the difficulty of replicating spaceflight on the ground and the importance of actually flying to see how things really work.
Right, let's carry on with the timeline.
Of course. At 04.44, the retro attitude maneuver. They aligned the spacecraft perfectly for firing the retro rockets, the ones that slow the capsule down for its descent. They reached apogee, the highest point, at about 05.00. Altitude was roughly 115 statute miles, downrange distance about 150 statute miles. Then retrofire at 05.15. They fired the 3 solid-fuel retro rockets, one after the other. Getting the timing and thrust of those rockets right was critical, essential for a safe and accurate re-entry.
There was a little problem with the pitch indicator during retrofire, wasn't there?
Yeah. Yes, there was. Shepard got a bit confused about the pitch indicator. They'd updated the reference position for retrofire attitude, but hadn't told him, so he ended up making some unintended pitch adjustments early on in the retrofire sequence. Luckily, he was a skilled pilot, quickly recognized the issue and corrected it. It didn't jeopardize the trajectory. But this incident shows how vital communication is between mission control and the astronaut. Clear and timely communication. Especially during those high-pressure moments, it likely led to a review of communication protocols just to prevent anything similar happening again.
I see. What happened after retrofire?
They jettisoned the retro pack at 06.15. That's the bit with the spent retro rockets. Got rid of it to make sure it didn't interfere with the heat shield during re-entry. Funnily enough, the confirmation light for the jettison failed. A little electrical fault. But TAPCOM, Deke Slayton, he was able to confirm it for Shepard using the telemetry data. So even when something breaks inside the capsule, mission control is there, watching, making sure everything is okay. They're vital to mission success and astronaut safety. Re-entry started around 07.15. That's when the capsule really felt the deceleration, peaking at 11.6 gems. Quite a force for Shepard to endure.
A considerable force, indeed.
Oh yes, quite substantial. Then, at 09.38, out came the drogue parachute, deployed at 22,000 feet to start slowing the capsule down and stabilizing it. Then the main parachute, much bigger at 10.15, deployed at 10,000 feet, slowed the descent even more, ready for a safe splashdown. And finally, splashdown. North Atlantic Ocean, about 300 nautical miles from the launch site. That was at 15.22. Just over 15 minutes, packed with critical events. Everything had to happen precisely.
So just over 15 minutes in total. You mentioned Shepard's observations during the flight. He could see the Earth, couldn't he, through the periscope?
He could. In those early Mercury capsules, the periscope was their main way of seeing the Earth, the horizon. They had 2 small windows, too, but the periscope was key. Shepard did have a bit of a problem. A filter in the periscope optics wasn't quite right, affected the colors a bit, but even so, he could see the landmasses through the clouds. He reported spotting Florida's east coast, Andros Island in the Bahamas, that sort of thing. These visual observations, they weren't just for Shepard's benefit. They were gathering data, you see, about visibility from the capsule, how well the viewing systems worked, useful for future Earth observation tasks.
And he wasn't just sightseeing. He was actively testing the capsule's control systems, wasn't he? Trying out both the automatic and manual modes.
Oh yes, a major part of the mission was to see how the attitude control system performed in space. Shepard used both the automatic stabilization and control system, or ASCS, and the manual control system. Check how the capsule responded in pitch, yaw, and roll, the 3 axes of motion. He even tried the fly-by-wire mode briefly. That's where his manual stick inputs controlled the automatic jets electronically. He said it felt very smooth, gave him a real sense of control. All this testing was vital to prove that the control systems worked as they should, to give the astronauts confidence that they could fly the Mercury capsule in space.
And then the recovery after splashdown. That was remarkably quick, wasn't it?
It was. Freedom 7 came down in the designated area of the North Atlantic. Within minutes, the recovery aircraft were there. A helicopter from the USS Lake Champlain got both Shepard and the capsule out of the water just 11 minutes after splashdown. That's impressive. Shows how well they planned everything, how ready and efficient the recovery teams were. Getting the astronaut and the spacecraft back safely and quickly, that was crucial to the mission's success.
And the state of Freedom 7 after all that. It was in surprisingly good shape, wasn't it?
It was. The engineers looked it over and found it was in excellent condition. It had survived the launch, the vacuum of space, the heat of re-entry. They even said that, technically, it could have flown again. But of course, a spacecraft this important, this historic, deserved a different fate. The fact it was still in such good condition after a mission like that, well, that gave them valuable data, showed them how well it was designed and built, helped them improve the Mercury capsules that followed, and spacecraft design in general.
Right. So let's talk about the impact, the legacy of this mission. It was the first time an American had gone into space. A huge achievement.
Without a doubt. Freedom 7 proved that an American astronaut could handle the extreme conditions of spaceflight. The G-forces during launch and re-entry, the weightlessness, it all checked out. And it gave them a lot of data about how the Mercury capsule systems performed in actual space conditions. This data was essential, you see. They used it to modify designs, improve procedures for the next Mercury missions, pave the way for longer flights, more complex maneuvers in orbit.
But as we said earlier, the Soviets had already done an orbital flight. That kind of took the shine off America's achievement, didn't it? At least internationally.
Yes, it did, to an extent. Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight just 3 weeks before, well, it put the Soviets in the lead, at least in the eyes of the world. But Freedom 7 was still a huge step for the U.S. space program. It laid the groundwork, provided the experience and data for everything that came after.
And now we celebrate National Astronaut Day on May 5th in its honor.
That's right. Every year, on the anniversary of the launch, we remember this first crewed flight, a testament to courage and ingenuity.
And Freedom 7 itself has been on quite a journey since coming back to Earth, from splashdown to museums, all sorts of places.
Quite a tour, yes. NASA gave it to the Smithsonian Institution, recognizing how important it was. It was displayed at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland for a long time, then moved to the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston in 2012, and for the 60th anniversary in 2021, they had it at the Smithsonian's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. Now it's at its permanent home, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., a real, tangible reminder of this pivotal moment in history.
And the story of Freedom 7 has found its way into popular culture, hasn't it? Books, films, even video games.
It has. Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, told the story of the Mercury 7 astronauts and their achievements, including Shepard's flight. They made it into a film, too, very well known, very influential, and it's popped up in other historical dramas, documentaries, even in the video game Fallout 3, though that's a more fictionalized take, an alternate history. But all these things, they help keep the story of Freedom 7 alive, introduce it to new generations.
So, to sum up our deep dive into Freedom 7, it was a truly groundbreaking mission, wouldn't you say? The first step in a long and ambitious journey for the U.S. space program.
Absolutely. It achieved its main goals. It showed that humans could handle space flight, and it rigorously tested the Mercury capsule systems. There were challenges along the way, from the preparations to the flight itself, but it was a triumph of technical skill and human courage. Alan Shepard's story, the delays, the frustrations, the eventual success, it embodies the spirit of those early days of space exploration.
It does. It makes you think about the pressure they were under, all the technical and human elements that had to come together for that one short flight. How did that one suborbital hop lead to the amazing things we've achieved in space since then? And what does it tell us about pushing boundaries, achieving the impossible? Something to ponder, isn't it? Maybe our listener will be inspired to learn more about Project Mercury, about those brave individuals who ventured into the unknown all those years ago. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
All right, so let's dive right in, shall we? This time, we're looking at a really key moment in those early days of space exploration, the Mercury Redstone 4 mission, or as most people know it, the Liberty Bell 7 flight. We've got a pretty good amount of stuff to go through, actually, mission notes, timelines, all the technical specs, even some historical analysis thrown in there.
Right.
So what we're going for here is, well, to try and pull out the most important bits, the most interesting parts of this whole mission, and present it all to you in a way that makes sense.
Yes. And of course, this mission, coming so soon after Alan Shepard's, that first American suborbital flight, it really showed how far the U.S. had come in the space race, you know? It was Gus Grissom at the controls for this one, the Mercury program's second human spaceflight.
Exactly, yeah. And it's important to remember what it was like back then, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
21st of July, 1961. The whole world had its eyes on this. The anticipation, I mean, for this second human spaceflight, it must have been incredible.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, the Mercury program, it was still in those very early stages, and every single flight, you know, they were learning so much from them. Yeah. And Liberty Bell 7, well, it had some pretty interesting changes compared to Shepard's Freedom 7 capsule.
Oh, yeah, the spacecraft, Liberty Bell 7. Well, one of the first things you notice is that centerline window, isn't it? Quite different from those two side portholes on Freedom 7. Why the change?
Well, the main reason was to give the pilot better visibility. This window, it was a trapezoidal shape and made from several layers of Vicor glass. Really tough stuff.
Okay.
They designed it to be just as strong as the rest of the capsule's pressure vessel, you see. It could handle a lot of heat and pressure.
Really something. And then there's the name Liberty Bell 7. It's clearly a nod to the Mercury 7 astronauts, isn't it? And that number, well, that became a bit of a tradition after Shepard's Freedom 7.
Yeah, it did.
And Grissom, well, he added his own touch with that white diagonal stripe he had painted on the outside, making it look like the Liberty Bell.
Yes, that stripe, copying the famous crack, it was quite a symbolic thing, really, especially with the Mercury capsule being, well, bell-shaped.
Right.
But perhaps the biggest change, and certainly the one that caused the most debate later on, was that new explosive hatch.
Ah, yes, the explosive hatch. I mean, that became a huge part of how this mission is remembered, didn't it? It was a totally different approach to getting out in an emergency compared to that old latching system. So what was the thinking behind this new design? What were they trying to fix?
Well, they needed a much faster way to escape. That was the main thing. The old bolted hatch, it was slow and awkward to open, and that was a big worry, especially after splashdown when every second could count. The explosive hatch, well, it still used the same 70 titanium bolts, but they were designed to break easily. And there was a mild detonating fuse running all the way around the hatch. You see, this new design, it was meant for quick escapes, but it shows a problem that engineers often face: how to make something safe, but also prevent it from going off accidentally. It's a perfect example of how, when you're pushing the boundaries, you often find new, unexpected problems.
So if there was an emergency, how did they set off this hatch? There were ways to do it from inside and outside the capsule, right?
That's right. Inside, the pilot could take out a safety pin and then push a plunger with a force of about 25 newtons. But if the safety pin was still in, well, then it would take a much bigger push, about 180 newtons, to set it off.
Okay, and what about from outside?
Well, from the outside, say if the pilot was injured or something, a rescuer could open a small panel and pull a lanyard. That would trigger the explosive bolts.
So this new design, it was quite a bit lighter than the old hatch, wasn't it? And I believe it was also considered better suited for the later Mercury capsules that would go into orbit.
You're right, it was. It saved about 18 kilograms in weight, which is a lot when you're talking about spacecraft.
Yeah, I bet.
Liberty Bell 7 had a few other notable improvements, too. There was a new rate stabilization control system.
Yeah.
This gave the pilot much finer control over the capsule's attitude.
Right.
And they also had a better way to separate the spacecraft from the Redstone booster. They used what they called posigrade rockets. These are small rockets that fire forward, and they put these in the adapter that connects the capsule to the rocket. This gave a more powerful and reliable separation.
Okay. And am I right in thinking they also redesigned the fairing to make it more aerodynamic during the ascent?
Yes, they did.
And they added extra padding to the pilot's couch to make it more comfortable and supportive. And they even rearranged the instrument panel so it was easier to see and reach everything. It seems they were really taking on board everything they had learned from Shepard's first flight.
Oh, absolutely. They were constantly refining and improving the design based on the data and feedback from each mission. Now, moving on to the mission preparations themselves, Gus Grissom was chosen as the pilot way back in January of 1961, and John Glenn was his backup.
Right.
The Redstone rocket arrived at Cape Canaveral in June, and after a very thorough review of the mission in the middle of July, they decided everything was ready for launch. This careful review process, it shows how much attention to detail they had in those early days of spaceflight. I mean, they went over every single part and procedure with a fine-tooth comb.
But then, as so often happens with these complex operations, the weather threw a spanner in the works. Didn't they have to delay the launch a few times because the conditions weren't right? And on one occasion, I think Grissom was actually strapped into the capsule, ready to go.
Yes, that's right. It must have been incredibly frustrating for him, all suited up and ready to go, only to be held back by the weather.
And then, even on the morning of the launch, they ran into another snag. A misaligned bolt on the hatch during those final checks. 1 bolt out of 70.
Yes, quite a predicament. But after some discussion and careful consideration, they chose to press ahead with the launch, even with the fault. They decided that the remaining 69 bolts would be enough.
Amazing when you think about it. They were paying attention to every tiny detail, even down to a single bolt. And then finally, liftoff. July 21st, 1961, at precisely 12.24.36 Coordinated Universal Time.
A truly historic moment. Grissom said afterwards that he felt, well, a bit scared in those first few moments, and who can blame him? This was completely new territory after all. But as the Redstone rocket climbed higher and faster, his confidence grew. The liftoff was smooth by all accounts, although he did mention that the vibrations got stronger as they went through the atmosphere.
So the ascent. From what we know, everything went pretty much according to plan, right? The cabin pressure sealed properly, and the environmental control systems kept the temperature and air inside the capsule comfortable. I even read that Grissom noticed the horizon change in color as they gained altitude and speed.
Yes, it's true. And then, of course, the launch escape tower, which was there to pull the capsule away from the rocket if anything went disastrously wrong during ascent, was jettisoned once it was no longer needed. About 2 minutes and 20 seconds into the flight, the Redstone engine cut off. By this point, Liberty Bell 7 was traveling at around 200 miles per hour.
Right.
After the engine cut off, the spacecraft separated from the booster using that new, more forceful method with the posigrade rockets. It ensured a clean and reliable separation from the spent booster stage.
Now, that moment when they transitioned to zero gravity, to weightlessness, it must have been quite disorienting, even with all the centrifuge training that Grissom would have gone through. It really highlights just how difficult it is for the human body to adapt to space.
Oh, without a doubt, it's a completely alien environment.
Oh.
And reports do suggest that he experienced a brief period of disorientation, which is perfectly understandable. After separating, the spacecraft automatically turned itself around, getting ready for the ballistic part of the flight. And at that point, Grissom took over manual control of the capsule's attitude.
All right then, ready to delve into some fascinating space history.
Certainly am.
Brilliant. Today we're focusing on the Mercury Atlas 6 mission, MA6 for short. You know, the one that really put America on the orbital map, their first crewed orbital flight.
A pivotal moment in the space race, without a doubt.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've got a treasure trove of resources, detailed mission notes, timelines, even some quizzes and study guides from the period. It's remarkable how meticulously documented this whole endeavor was.
Oh, quite. Reflects the intense scrutiny and, well, the weight of expectation on the whole program, wouldn't you say?
Indeed. So imagine it. February 20, 1962, the world is holding its breath, and America is ready to launch its first astronaut into orbit. Quite a day.
It was, wasn't it? Palpable tension, a real sense of history in the making.
Absolutely. Now let's start with the basics. The pilot and the spacecraft, John H. Glenn, chosen as the prime pilot, announced back in December 61, just after the Mercury Atlas V flight with, remember Enos the chimpanzee?
Ah, yes. Enos. Crucial flight, that one. Demonstrated the viability of the Mercury capsule for a full orbital mission. Quite a reassurance, especially after the Soviets had already achieved orbital flights with Vostok 1 and 2.
Right, and America, at that point, had only managed those suborbital hops. So a big step forward.
Oh, absolutely. A huge psychological boost, I'd say.
Now, the spacecraft itself, Friendship 7, that 7 is significant, isn't it? It honors the original Mercury 7 astronauts, a tradition that I believe started somewhat accidentally with Alan Shepard's Freedom 7.
You're right. Shepard's capsule just happened to be factory model number 7. But the others liked the symbolism, so it stuck.
Yeah.
And Glenn, I believe, chose the name Friendship to emphasize, well, goodwill, as he circled the globe.
It was a potent message, wasn't it? At a time when the Cold War tensions were so high, it wasn't just about technological one-upmanship, it was a statement of intent.
Oh, entirely. A demonstration of peaceful intentions, despite the inherent competition.
Now, Friendship 7 was actually Mercury spacecraft number 13. A little bit of trivia for you. Assembly started in May 1960, and it was delivered to Cape Canaveral in August the following year.
Yes, so a lengthy development process, as one would expect. And then, on January 1962, it was stacked with the Atlas launch vehicle at Launch Complex 14, bringing it all together, the culmination of years of work.
Absolutely. And speaking of work, let's move on to the pre-flight preparations and the sheer amount of unknowns they were facing. It's easy to forget now, with all we know, just how little was understood about human spaceflight back then.
Oh, completely. Aside from whatever secrets the Soviets were keeping, this was very much venturing into uncharted territory. I mean, just look at the contents of the onboard medical kit. Morphine, phentermine sulfate, benzylamine hydrochloride, even racemic amphetamine sulfate.
It's a bit of a pharmacological jumble, isn't it? Shows you the range of physiological challenges they were anticipating, though.
Oh, most definitely. And of course, the survival kit. Desalter kit, a dye marker, PK2 raft, all the essentials for, a less than ideal splashdown.
It's a stark reminder of the inherent risks, wasn't it? This wasn't a jaunt. This was a foray into the unknown.
Quite. Oh, and MA6. It's the first American flight with a dedicated urine collection device. Might seem a minor detail, but it shows how much they were learning for those earlier suborbital flights.
You're right. Necessity really breeds innovation. Now, there's a rather endearing story about Glenn wanting a personal camera, a Minolta Hymatic 35mm. He even bought it himself.
He did, didn't he? Shows you his initiative. Though one imagines using a film camera in zero gravity presented a unique set of problems. Apparently one film canister even floated away behind the instrument panel.
I suppose those are the sorts of occupational hazards you face when orbiting the Earth. Now let's talk about the rocket that got Friendship 7 up there. The Atlas LV-3B, specifically Atlas number 109D, arrived at Cape Canaveral in late November 61.
Ah, the Atlas.
Yeah.
A real workhorse of the early space program. And, NASA initially hoped to launch in 61 to keep pace with the Soviets, so the pressure was on.
Right. And it all came together, as we said, on January 2nd, 62, Friendship 7, atop the Atlas at Launch Complex 14. But the path to launch, well, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing, was it? There were several delays.
Several might be putting it mildly.
Yeah.
These were significant postponements. It really highlights the complexities of rocket science at the time.
It does. Initially scheduled for January 16th, it was pushed to the 20th because of fuel tank issues with the Atlas. Then a faulty yaw gyro. They had to replace it, the sensor that helps determine the spacecraft's rotation.
Quite essential, that. And then, on January 27th, a launch attempt was scrubbed at T-minus 29 minutes. Thick clouds. Imagine the frustration.
I can only imagine. Then, just a few days later, a fuel leak while they're preparing for another attempt. Soaked in insulation blanket. Another 2 weeks of delays for repairs. Even on February 14th, bad weather forced a postponement.
It must have been incredibly trying for everyone involved. But it shows the meticulous approach they took, even with the immense pressure to get that spacecraft off the ground.
Absolutely. And, before they finally got the green light, the Flight Safety Review Board actually met to review recent Atlas flights. There had been some failures, and they needed to be sure.
Oh, a critical step. They determined that 2 of the guidance failures weren't relevant to the Mercury program's guidance system, and the other 2, well, they concluded those are just random quality issues not likely to affect the Mercury hardware, which was under much stricter supervision. A thorough risk assessment, essential for the peace of mind of everyone involved.
So finally, the 20th of February arrives. Glenn boards Friendship 7 just after 11:00 UTC. Even then, there were more hiccups. A faulty guidance component had to be swapped out, and then a broken hatch bolt. Talk about a nail-biting morning.
It really shows you how many things can go wrong, doesn't it? Every component had to be perfect. But finally, at 14:47 UTC, liftoff. Scott Carpenter, the capsule communicator, uttered those famous words, "Godspeed, John Glenn." A truly remarkable moment.
It sends shivers down your spine even now. And Glenn reported some vibration during max Q, the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure.
Oh yes, entirely expected at that stage. Then at 2 minutes and 14 seconds, booster engine cut off. BE go. The boosters jettisoned, followed by the escape tower.
And the Atlas performed incredibly well. At sustainer engine cutoff, SICO, it was only 7 feet per second below the planned velocity.
Remarkably accurate. A testament to the engineers and technicians who prepared it. Then, a few seconds later, capsule separation. John Glenn was finally in orbit.
He was, and there were 3 orbits in total. But even that first orbit wasn't without incident. Right after separation, there was a roll error. The rate damping operation was a bit delayed, which meant using more fuel than planned to correct it.
Yes, orbital mechanics can be unforgiving, can't they? Even small deviations require corrections. But Glenn managed it. He then reported seeing a dust storm over Kano, Nigeria. Quite a sight from up there, I imagine.
Absolutely. And he noticed a discrepancy in the attitude indicators, though he preferred to fly facing forward anyway. Then came the first orbital sunset over the Indian Ocean. A beautiful sight he described in quite poetic terms.
He did. And as he passed over Perth, Australia, the residents had turned on all their lights to mark his passage. A lovely gesture, a real connection between Earth and space.
It really was. Then, as the sun rose again over Canton Island, he encountered those mysterious fireflies, those bright specks flowing past the capsule.
Ah, yes, later attributed to ice crystals venting from the spacecraft catching the sunlight. A beautiful, if initially puzzling, phenomenon. However, things weren't all smooth sailing. Glenn started having problems with the yaw thruster, which forced him to take manual control.
A rather worrying development so early in the flight. And on his second orbit, ground control became quite concerned about a sensor reading, the segment 51 sensor. It seemed to indicate that the heat shield and landing bag might be unlocked. They kept asking Glenn to confirm the landing bag deploy switch was off.
Understandably, they were worried. The heat shield, well, that was vital for survival during re-entry. A faulty sensor reading could have been disastrous. Meanwhile, Glenn also confirmed that those fireflies weren't related to the reaction control jets, adding to the mystery.
And to make things even more complicated, he was reporting feeling too warm in his pressure suit and warned about excess cabin humidity. Another challenge to manage. Oh, and his secondary oxygen supply started to drop.
A series of minor issues, but each with the potential to escalate. They even tried a pilot observation experiment over the Indian Ocean with star shell flares. But the weather obscured the view, unfortunately, and with all the manual control he was having to do, fuel consumption was becoming an issue.
Quite. By the third orbit, propellant levels were a real concern. There was a rather lighthearted exchange with Gordon Cooper about meeting his monthly flying requirement, but back on the ground, everyone was focused on that Segment 51 issue.
Every piece of data was scrutinized, as you can imagine. Every anomaly could have meant the difference between success and failure.
Absolutely. And then comes the re-entry, one of the most tense moments of the whole flight. Because of the concern over the heat shield, Mercury Control made a critical decision. They told Glenn to keep the retro pack attached during re-entry. Initially, the plan was to jettison it after the retrofire sequence. This was a big call.
It was. Mission Director Walter Williams went against the advice of Chris Kraft, the flight director. A calculated risk based on the uncertainty surrounding that Segment 51 reading. And Glenn had to manually retract the periscope as well, the one he'd been using to see outside.
So he initiates the retrofire sequence, 3 retro rockets firing as planned. Then, as Friendship 7 plunges back into the atmosphere, Glenn starts hearing noises. He described them as small things brushing against the capsule, followed by the alarming observation of a real fireball outside.
It turned out to be the retro package strap. It had partially detached and was burning up in the intense heat of re-entry. Understandably, Glenn first thought it might be fragments of the heat shield, a rather terrifying thought. Then, Friendship 7 started oscillating wildly, pitching and rolling almost uncontrollably.
He described it as like a falling leaf. He had to engage the auxiliary damping system to try and stabilize the spacecraft, and then he made the decision to deploy the drogue parachute manually at 28,000 feet, much earlier than planned.
With the capsule shaking like that and fuel running low, he had to act. It was a bold move, but it worked.
Thankfully, it did. And finally, after 4 hours, 55 minutes, and 23 seconds, Friendship 7 splashed down in the North Atlantic Ocean. Missed the target by about 40 miles, though.
The retrofire calculations, you see, hadn't quite accounted for the mass reduction from all the consumables used during the flight. But the USS Noah, or Steelhead as it was called, had spotted the capsule descending and was there quickly.
17 minutes later, they reached Friendship 7, and it was so hot inside that Glenn had to use the hatch detonator to get out. His first words as he emerged were, "It was hot in there."
A classic understatement from John Glenn. But miraculously, both he and the spacecraft were in good condition. And later analysis showed that the Segment 51 warning was just a faulty sensor. The heat shield had held perfectly.
So a successful mission, albeit a rather dramatic one. And the story of Friendship 7 didn't end there. It went on a world tour, the 4th orbit of Friendship 7.
It did, a grand tour for a remarkable spacecraft. And today you can see it at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. Quite a sight.
It is a tangible piece of history.
Yeah.
And of course, the mission has been immortalized in films like The Right Stuff and even featured in Hidden Figures. And on the 50th anniversary in 2012, John Glenn, still going strong, actually talked to the crew of the International Space Station. Quite a moment.
It was a wonderful link between the pioneers of space exploration and the current generation.
Absolutely. So what have we learned from this deep dive? America's first crewed orbital flight, a mission beset by technical challenges, unexpected problems, all overcome through human ingenuity, skill, and, let's not forget, a good deal of luck. It truly underlined America's commitment to the space race.
It did. And what's so fascinating is, the things that could have gone wrong, the near misses. That faulty sensor, for example, leading to a complete reassessment of the re-entry procedure, and all in real time. It shows how vital reliable data is in such high-stakes situations, and the need to be prepared for anything, even for the failure of seemingly minor components. And those early propellant issues, they highlight the delicate balance of staying on course in orbit Even slight deviations can have consequences.
I certainly can. And it's a reminder, isn't it, of the incredible bravery of those early astronauts, the sheer uncertainty, the risks they took, not knowing for sure what awaited them in space or on re-entry. They were pioneers in the truest sense, paving the way for everything that followed. What future first, I wonder, will hold similar levels of risk and reward as we continue to push the boundaries of exploration?
A thought-provoking question indeed. And for our listeners, if you want to explore this fascinating story further, we urge you to delve into those source materials. There's a wealth of detail waiting to be uncovered, a real treasure trove for anyone intrigued by the early days of the space race.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the incredible feat that was Mercury Atlas 6. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Great. Mercury Atlas 7 then. Fourth crewed Mercury flight, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Indeed, 24th of May, 1962. Quite a day. Scott Carpenter, Aurora 7, 18th Mercury spacecraft. 6th human in space, actually.
Quite the club to be a part of back then. So 3 orbits this mission. We're going in deep today, aren't we? Objectives, the flight, and, well, that landing. We got detailed timelines, the official reports, even some of Carpenter's own writing on it.
Should give us some good insight. Multiple angles. Really build a picture of what happened.
Now, Carpenter wasn't the first choice, was he? Deke Slayton was meant to be in that seat.
Ah, that's right. Slayton was down for it. During a routine centrifuge session, they found a cardiac dysrhythmia. Irregular heartbeat, essentially. Not something you want popping up mid-flight. Grounded him, sadly.
So Slayton out. But instead of Shira, who was his backup, they went for Carpenter. He'd backed up Glenn on Mercury Atlas 6. Seen as the most ready, I suppose.
Yes. Been right there with Glenn through all the prep. Knew the mission inside and out. And Slayton had already named his craft Delta 7. 4th crewed flight. Simple enough.
Bit on the nose, maybe. Carpenter went for Aurora 7, didn't he? Bit more flair there.
Multifaceted reasoning, actually. Open skies. That new dawn of space travel. The 7, naturally, for the Mercury 7. But he did mention later it was also his childhood address, Aurora Avenue, 7th Street, in Boulder, Colorado. Though he admitted that link only struck him after he'd chosen the name.
Well, that's a nice coincidence. Adds a bit of, well, human touch to it all.
Indeed.
Right. Pilot sorted, craft christened. What were they aiming for with this one? More shakedown of the Mercury systems.
Partly, yes. Longer flight, building confidence in those systems for extended missions. But the real meat of it, so to speak, was the scientific experiments. Only on what Glenn did, but with their own unique set of goals.
Right, into the nuts and bolts then. The Atlas rocket, Aurora 7 itself, much different from what Glenn flew on.
Some tweaks. The Atlas booster, 107D, they kept the insulation blanket on the tank bulkhead. They were going to remove it on later ones, figured it wasn't needed, but stuck with it for this one, just in case.
What else on the rocket front?
LOX tank skin. They thickened it further on the 107D. The capsules were getting heavier, longer missions, more on board. Needed the extra strength.
Makes sense. When did these components arrive at the Cape, ready to go?
Aurora 7 itself, back in November 61. The Atlas booster, March 62, fresh from the conveyor factory.
Now, weren't there some worries about the Atlas at this point? Other programs having a few, shall we say, unscheduled disassemblies?
Right, yes.
Yeah.
After Glenn's flight, couple of hiccups, 11F, 1F,
Right.
and that first Atlas Centaur launch caused a bit of a stir. They convened the Flight Safety Review Board to have a good look.
And the verdict, big threat to Mercury Atlas 7.
They reckoned it was mostly down to quality control on those other programs, not so much a systemic problem. And the Mercury program, much stricter controls, better oversight. Plus that 3-second hold down, different engine start. All meant those rough combustion issues they thought some Atlases had were less likely here. The Centaur, well, that was the upper stage, wasn't it? Not the Atlas itself.
So, calculated risk then. Believed their procedures were good enough?
Exactly.
Sent itself, all smooth sailing.
Pretty much. Booster performed admirably. Aurora 7, right on target for orbit. One little blip, though. Sustainer engine hydraulic switch showed a pressure loss at 265 seconds. Flipped to the abort position.
Blimey, that sounds a bit close for comfort. Why didn't it, well, abort?
Thankfully, the ASIS, the abort system, needed 2 of those switches to trip. And the other data, all fine. Hydraulics working as they should. Reckoned it was just the cold from the LOX lines playing havoc with the sensor.
Makes you think, doesn't it? All those early flights, one sensor reading away from disaster?
Quite.
Did they fix that for the next flights then?
Oh, yeah. Bit of thermal insulation around those switches from then on. Lesson learned, I suppose.
Key timings then. Pico, Sitco, all that.
Pico at 124 seconds, Sitco at 305, Aurora 7 in orbit, 17,547 miles per hour, 7,844 meters per second if you prefer.
Right, zipping along then. Any changes on Aurora 7 itself?
A few. They'd had that premature drogue deployment on the previous flight. So Carpenter and the crew, they suggested some changes to the periscope, the drogue system itself. Avoid that happening again. And they added a low-level commutator, basically a whole bunch more sensors, measuring temperature at 28 points around the spacecraft, really getting a detailed picture of the thermal environment.
Data.
Absolutely.
Right, up in orbit. What were they actually trying to do up there science-wise?
Right, so big focus on this one was liquids in zero-G. Carpenter had a sealed glass bottle, observing how the liquid inside behaved. Proper science.
Seems simple enough.
It's fundamental, though, isn't it? Fluid dynamics and microgravity, still important today, designing space stations, all that.
True. What else on the to-do list?
Photography. They wanted a good look at Earth's weather patterns, so Carpenter had cameras for that. Plus, he got 19 photos of the setting sun, the flattened sun, from orbit. Quite something, I'd imagine.
I bet any ground-based stuff. Coordinating with folks back home.
They tried to get him to observe a flare from the ground. He had a special light meter. Sadly, didn't work out. Happens sometimes, eh? Science isn't always predictable.
What was that balloon experiment then? Sounded a bit out there.
That was interesting. Tethered balloon. 30-inch Mylar sphere. 5 colors on a 100-foot nylon line. They wanted to see how space affected the colors, reflectivity, and all that. Plus, they had a strain gauge to measure the drag. Partially successful, they said.
Partially? What went wrong?
Sources don't say exactly. Maybe it didn't deploy properly, or they didn't get all the data they hoped for. Bit of a mystery.
And Carpenter himself, he had specific training for one observation, right? Something to do with the atmosphere.
Yes, the air glow layer. That faint light in the upper atmosphere. Glenn had seen it, so they wanted Carpenter to have another look. He got specific training for that.
Busy guy up there. Anything else he reported seeing? Anything unusual?
Well, he saw the fireflies. Glenn had reported those too. Carpenter, he described them more like snowflakes, though. Different sizes, brightness, colors, even one that looked like a helical shaving, he said.
What were they then? Some sort of space dust?
Figured it out on his third orbit by accident. Bumped his hand on the cabin wall. A bunch of them appeared outside. Turns out it was ice particles shaking loose from the spacecraft.
Right, so just bits of frost. Solved it by bumping his elbow.
Exactly. Bit of an unintentional experiment.
Right. What about the less exciting stuff? Food, all that. They moved on from the tubes, didn't they?
They did.
Yeah.
First, solid food in space, freeze-dried cubes in a plastic bag. Not quite a banquet. And, well, they had problems with crumbs.
What, bits of space food floating about?
It seems the cubes were coated to stop them crumbling. But that coating might have got damaged before launch. Carpenter said there were crumbs everywhere, worried they'd get sucked into the air intakes or he'd choke on them.
Sounds messy.
And to top it off, the cabin got quite toasty. 39 Celsius, 102 Fahrenheit, melted his chocolate bar. By the second orbit, he'd pretty much given up on eating.
Not a great culinary experience then. Beyond the science and the snacks, any major technical issues crop up while he was in orbit?
One rather big one. The pitch horizon scanner went on the fritz. Key bit of kit, that. Part of the automatic control system keeps the spacecraft pointing the right way.
Not good. What did he do?
Luckily, he could control it manually. Used his own observations, kept things on track. Training paid off there.
Makes you appreciate the skills those early astronauts needed, doesn't it? Not just riding a rocket.
Absolutely.
Last thing on the orbital phase. Views of Earth. Any good.
Kachi. Lots of cloud cover. Got some decent looks at the southwestern U.S. and western Africa, but when he passed over Florida, completely socked in. Shame.
Right. So a mixed bag up there. Now, re-entry, the landing. Bit of a miscalculation there.
That's putting it mildly. Landed 250 miles, 400 kilometers off target. Quite a way off. Shows you, even with all the planning, human error, little oversights can have massive consequences.
And we've got a whole list of contributing factors, don't we? Where did it all start to unravel?
Well, Carpenter himself admitted he started the landing prep a bit late. Said he was distracted watching those fireflies on the last orbit. Meant he was a bit rushed.
Fascinating sight, but maybe not the best timing?
Quite. Then, when he went to engage the automatic systems for retrofire, things got sticky.
Oh, so?
That automatic stabilization system wouldn't hold the right attitude. 34 degrees pitch, 0 yaw, what they needed for the retrofire. Had to use other controls.
And it was during this switching bout, wasn't it, that a crucial mistake was made?
Yes. When he moved to fly-by-wire control, he forgot to disengage the manual system. So for 10 minutes, both systems were running at once, guzzling fuel.
10 minutes? That must have eaten into the reserves.
Hugely. Limited his ability to make corrections later on.
Yeah.
And, well, you can bet they changed procedures after that.
I should think so. Then there's a retrofire attitude itself. Which way the spacecraft was pointing when they fired the rockets. That was off too, wasn't it?
It was. Carpenter said his instruments and what he was seeing out the window, they didn't match up. So he went with what he could see. Problem was, Aurora 7 was pointing 25 degrees to the right of where it should have been. Big difference.
Pushing him further off course right from the start.
Exactly. And then to add to it, he fired the retro rockets 3 seconds late.
Much, sure.
At those speeds, even 3 seconds is 15 miles, 24 kilometers out. All these little errors adding up.
So already off course, no fuel to correct. Any chance of saving it at this point?
Well, after retrofire, the fuel gauges showed some left, in both the automatic and manual tanks. Carpenter was going to use the manual fuel to try and get the right re-entry attitude, but then he found out the manual gauge was faulty. Empty tank.
Oh dear. No last-minute heroics then. So, splashdown. Where did he end up?
Took them nearly an hour to find him. Northeast of Puerto Rico. USS Farragut got there first, about 40 minutes after splashdown. Then helicopters from the Intrepid, they picked him up. The John R. Pierce eventually towed Aurora 7 to Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico.
Imagine that, bobbing about for an hour after all that. How was he, physically?
Bit tired, I'd imagine. But otherwise, fit as a fiddle. No ill effects from the bumpy ride.
Well, that's good at least. But professionally, this wasn't good for Carpenter, was it? Chris Kraft, the flight director, wasn't a happy bunny.
Happy isn't quite the word. He was furious. Blamed Carpenter for wasting that fuel, said that's what caused the landing error.
And that was that for Carpenter's space career, wasn't it?
Pretty much. Never got another mission. Left NASA in '64, joined the Navy's Sea Lab program. Bit of a change of scenery.
What about Aurora 7 herself? Museum piece now.
Oh yeah, Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Quite the exhibit.
Right, let's run through that timeline again, just to be sure we've got it all.
Certainly. Launch, 7:45 a.m. Eastern Time. BCO, 1:24 seconds. SECO, 3:05. Separation not long after that. Retrofire, 4 hours, 30 minutes, 30 seconds. Drogue shoot, 4:50:20. Main shoot, 4:51:55. Splashdown, 4:57:10. All there, more or less.
So, Mercury Atlas 7. Got the science done, lots of data, but that landing, eh? Bit of a black mark.
It does rather overshadow things, doesn't it? But it's a great case study. How complex these missions are. All the tech, the human element, tiny things going wrong, cascading to the big problems.
All those little mistakes piling up, sending him hundreds of kilometers off course. Makes you think.
It does. But let's not forget, this mission, it did a lot of good. First, important data. Shows both the triumph and the risk of pushing those boundaries, going into space.
Absolutely. It really makes you wonder what other little things in all that complexity could have huge knock-on effects. Bit worrying when you think about it. Fantastic deep dive, though. Really gets you thinking.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right then, time to roll up our sleeves and delve into a bit of space history, eh? Specifically, we're going to have a good look at the Mercury Atlas 8 mission, or MA8 for short.
Right.
It was the 5th crewed spaceflight for the Americans.
It was indeed.
And the 3rd time they'd managed to get someone up into orbit.
Absolutely, a significant step.
Now, all this took place during a rather intense period, wouldn't you say? The space race was well and truly underway back in 1962.
It was a time of great tension and competition, that's for sure.
And the general consensus, I believe, was that the Soviets had something of an upper hand, particularly after those impressive long-duration flights they were pulling off.
Oh, absolutely. The Soviets were really setting the pace in those early years.
Vostok 2, for instance, managed a full day in orbit, which was quite a feat at the time.
A full day? Can you imagine?
So our aim today, if you will, is to unpack the MA8 flight in a bit of detail.
Sounds good.
We're going to look at the goals they set, how it all played out, and the ultimate outcomes.
A deep dive.
Precisely. And it's particularly fascinating, I think, to consider this mission as a sort of technical evaluation, especially given the rather long shadow cast by those Soviet achievements.
It certainly puts it into perspective.
Now, we're talking about Walter M. Schirra Jr. at the helm of the Sigma 7 spacecraft.
A skilled pilot, Schirra was.
Launch day was the 3rd of October, 1962.
A date etched in the annals of space history.
And it's important to remember that this flight was very much intended as a stepping stone towards longer U.S. orbital missions.
It was a crucial step in bridging the gap, so to speak.
They'd already had those 2 3-orbit Mercury flights, MA6 and MA7.
Yes, those earlier flights were important, but they were just dipping their toes in the water, really.
And MA8 was meant to push things a bit further.
Exactly, to build up their experience and demonstrate that they could operate in space for extended periods.
So let's rewind the clock a bit and delve into the context surrounding this mission.
By all means, context is key.
We've already touched upon the fact that by 62, the U.S. had only managed those brief suborbital hops.
Little more than glorified up and down trips, really.
Whereas the Soviets, well, they had 2 full-blown orbital flights under their belts, including that impressive 24-hour mission of Vostok 2.
It made the American effort seem rather paltry in comparison.
It's safe to say the U.S. had some catching up to do.
Without a doubt. They needed to prove that they could match the Soviets in terms of orbital endurance.
And the Mercury program, using the Atlas booster, was their answer to that challenge.
It was their workhorse, the Atlas. A powerful rocket capable of lofting the Mercury capsule into orbit.
It wasn't simply about getting into orbit, though, was it? It was about staying there.
But that's the real trick, isn't it? Staying up there for a significant length of time.
And that's where the Atlas came in.
Exactly. It provided the muscle needed not just to reach orbit, but to sustain multiple orbits.
Now, the initial plans for MA8 were quite ambitious, weren't they? There was talk of 6 or even 7 orbits?
Yes, they were clearly aiming high.
A far cry from those earlier 3-orbit flights.
They wanted to show the Soviets that they were serious about long-duration missions.
It was meant to be an intermediate step towards that coveted day-long mission.
A clear signal of intent.
But the final decision to settle on 6 orbits wasn't simply a matter of ambition, was it?
No, not at all. There were practical considerations at play.
Those contingency recovery plans, for instance.
Ah, yes, those pesky logistical details.
They had to factor in all sorts of potential landing zones.
And make sure they could get to the capsule within a reasonable time frame.
A tricky business, especially with a longer flight.
Indeed. And it ultimately led them to choose the Pacific Ocean as the primary recovery area for the 6-orbit mission.
Which, of course, had significant implications for the tracking network and the deployment of those recovery assets.
A huge logistical undertaking.
But just as they were finalizing those plans, the Soviets decided to throw a spanner in the works.
Or should we say, launch another spacecraft.
Indeed. August 1962 saw the launch of not 1, but 2 Vostok missions.
Vostok 3 and Vostok 4.
And they completely blew the American plans out of the water.
They really did. The Americans must have been reeling.
Vostok 3 racked up an incredible 64 orbits.
An astonishing feat of endurance.
And Vostok 4 wasn't far behind with 48 orbits.
The Soviets were operating on a whole different level.
I can only imagine the scramble that must have caused back at NASA.
There must have been some frantic meetings going on.
I recall reading that they even briefly considered trying to shoehorn some form of rendezvous capability into a Mercury capsule.
Rendezvous with a Mercury capsule? That would have been quite a feat.
Desperate times, perhaps?
It was certainly a bold idea.
I suppose it was a sign of just how determined they were to catch up.
They were willing to consider all options.
But in the end, that idea was shelved, wasn't it?
It was, and probably for the best.
Safety concerns, I imagine, and the sheer complexity of modifying the Mercury design at such short notice.
It was a risky proposition, and they ultimately decided to stick with the original plan for MA8.
A wise decision, in hindsight.
It allowed them to focus on the mission at hand and gather valuable data without introducing unnecessary risks.
So, with the space race intensifying and the Soviets pulling further ahead, the focus of MA8 shifted somewhat, wouldn't you say?
It did indeed. The emphasis became less about matching the Soviets' endurance and more about thoroughly evaluating the Mercury spacecraft and its systems.
A more pragmatic approach, perhaps?
There was a sensible shift in priorities.
They needed to ensure they had a solid foundation before attempting even longer missions.
Absolutely. It was all about gathering data, refining their understanding of how the spacecraft performed in space.
And Schirra, as the pilot, had a very active role to play in this technical evaluation.
He wasn't just along for the ride, that's for sure.
He conducted a whole series of flight control experiments, really putting the Sigma 7 through its paces.
He was essentially a flying test pilot, gathering crucial data on the spacecraft's capabilities.
He even manually rotated the spacecraft to assess its handling characteristics.
Not the easiest of tasks, I imagine.
And then there were those yaw and pitch maneuvers, testing the attitude control.
Precision movements, essential for maintaining the spacecraft's orientation.
And, incredibly, he even realigned the onboard gyroscopes while in flight.
Now that's impressive.
It sounds like he was kept quite busy up there.
He certainly had a full schedule.
And I remember reading his assessment of the manual rotation. He described it as rather sloppy.
Sloppy, eh? That's not exactly reassuring.
Well, it gives you an idea of the state of the technology at the time.
They were still very much in the early stages of spacecraft design.
And it highlights the importance of those fly-by-wire systems that were being developed.
Automated systems that can provide a more stable and precise control of the spacecraft.
Schirra also spent a considerable amount of time simply letting the spacecraft drift.
Drifting. Sounds a bit like taking a break.
Not quite. There was a very specific purpose behind it.
Of course, there always is in spaceflight.
It was all about fuel conservation.
The constant battle to make those precious fuel reserves last as long as possible.
By observing how the spacecraft behaved in both automated and passive drift modes, they could gain a better understanding of its efficiency.
Crucial information for planning those longer missions they were aiming for.
And fuel efficiency was a major factor in this whole evaluation, wasn't it?
It was paramount. They needed to squeeze every last drop of performance out of those fuel tanks.
They had to be sure they could stretch those resources for those ambitious future missions.
It was a key constraint on their plans.
And the good news is that MA8 actually used less fuel than anticipated.
That's very encouraging news indeed.
A testament, I believe, to Schirra's skillful piloting.
He certainly played his part in conserving those precious resources.
Which boosted their confidence in the spacecraft's ability to handle those longer flights.
A significant step in the right direction.
No, it wasn't just the spacecraft itself that was being put to the test, was it?
No, the entire ground infrastructure was under scrutiny as well.
That worldwide tracking and communications network.
A vital lifeline for any space mission.
It had to be robust enough to handle a crewed flight of that duration.
It was a crucial test for the entire support system.
And how did it fare?
Overall, it performed admirably.
Good to hear.
It demonstrated that they had the capability to track and communicate with a spacecraft over extended periods.
A crucial step in paving the way for those future long-duration missions.
Absolutely. They were building a solid foundation for the future of human spaceflight.
Now let's talk a little about the Sigma 7 spacecraft itself.
A marvel of engineering for its time.
It wasn't simply a carbon copy of those previous Mercury capsules, was it? There were a few tweaks and modifications for this longer flight.
There were indeed several significant changes were made to accommodate the extended mission duration.
Let's go through those, shall we?
By all means, let's break it down.
Firstly, they removed the thermal blankets from the retro-rocket motors.
A weight-saving measure, I presume.
Exactly. Every little bit helped when it came to maximizing their endurance.
A constant trade-off in spacecraft design, weight versus functionality.
They also added a SOFAR bomb.
Yes, that ingenious device.
SOFAR, for those who aren't familiar, stands for sound fixing and ranging.
It was an underwater acoustic system used to help locate the capsule after splashdown.
An added safety measure, especially with a landing zone as vast as the Pacific Ocean.
It provided an extra layer of reassurance.
And then there were the upgrades to the reaction control system.
Those little thrusters that help control the spacecraft's attitude.
Precisely. They needed to be in tip-top shape for this longer mission.
Ensuring they could maneuver and maintain the correct orientation in space.
And finally, they made some improvements to the communications equipment as well.
Keeping those communication channels clear was paramount for a mission of this duration.
It was their lifeline back to Earth.
The ability to communicate effectively with the ground crew was absolutely crucial.
So, a fair number of modifications to ensure Sigma 7 was up to the task.
They were leaving no stone unturned in their preparations.
And what about the Atlas booster itself?
Yes, the workhorse that got them up there in the first place.
How did it perform on this particular mission?
By and large, it performed as expected.
Which is good news, considering its crucial role.
It successfully delivered Sigma 7 into the intended orbit.
There were a couple of minor hiccups, though, weren't there?
There were a few anomalies, yes.
A momentary roll transient at liftoff, for instance?
A bit of a wobble, but nothing too dramatic.
And then there was the slightly below normal sustainer engine thrust, coupled with higher fuel consumption than they'd anticipated.
That does sound a bit concerning.
It seems they suspected a fuel leak might have been the culprit.
That would certainly explain the higher consumption.
But despite these issues, the Atlas did its job.
It did indeed. It got them safely into orbit, which is ultimately all that matters.
They'd also made some modifications to the Atlas prior to this flight, hadn't they?
They had, in an effort to improve its reliability.
There were those baffled fuel injectors, for instance.
Those were designed to address some of the combustion instability problems they'd encountered in earlier Atlas flights.
And then there was that new hypergolic fuel igniter,
A more reliable way to get those engines firing.
all aimed at making the Atlas a more dependable launch vehicle.
They were constantly refining the technology, learning from each flight.
And it seems those efforts paid off, despite those minor anomalies.
They did. The Atlas proved itself to be a capable launch vehicle.
So overall, a successful launch, albeit with a few heart-stopping moments.
A bit of drama is to be expected, I suppose, when you're pushing the boundaries of technology.
And once they were safely in orbit, the real work began.
The technical evaluation was the primary focus of the mission, after all.
Now, 6 orbits might not seem like a particularly long time by today's standards.
No, but back then, it was a significant step forward.
A far cry from those earlier 3-orbit missions.
It allowed them to gather much more data on the spacecraft's performance over an extended period.
So what did Schirra actually get up to during those 6 orbits?
Well, as we've discussed, he was kept busy with those flight control experiments, really putting the Sigma 7 through its paces.
Testing those manual controls, for instance.
Seeing how the spacecraft responded to his inputs.
And battling that pesky overheating issue with his pressure suit.
Yes, that unfortunate incident.
He had to adjust the suit's cooling and adapt his activities to manage it.
A testament to his adaptability as a pilot.
And then there were those scientific observations he was tasked with.
Trying to gather some data on the Earth and the space environment.
But those didn't go quite according to plan, did they?
Not entirely. The weather wasn't particularly cooperative.
Cloud cover scuppered most of those attempts.
A frustrating setback for the scientific objectives.
He was trying to observe those flares and use the xenon lamp, but to no avail.
The clouds got in the way.
But he did manage to confirm those fireflies that John Glenn had reported during his earlier flight.
Those strange, luminous particles that seemed to surround the capsule.
It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless.
It added to the growing body of knowledge about the orbital environment.
And the engineering tests continued unabated, didn't they?
They were the primary focus of the mission, after all.
Yaw and pitch maneuvers, gyroscope realignment, all meticulously executed and recorded.
Gathering valuable data on the spacecraft's performance.
And he even had a go with the periscope.
The periscope, eh? That sounds interesting.
Not particularly successful, though.
Oh, what was the problem?
It seems he found it rather difficult to use.
I suppose the Mercury capsule wasn't exactly designed for panoramic views.
It was cramped in there, and those small windows didn't help.
Not ideal for sightseeing.
But even those periods of drifting weren't simply downtime, were they?
No, they made use of every available moment.
Schirra conducted spatial awareness and motor control tests during those drifts.
Assessing how his body reacted to the microgravity environment.
And he also managed to squeeze in a light meal.
Demonstrating that astronauts could indeed eat in space.
Though I doubt it was a Michelin star experience.
Probably more akin to airline food, I imagine.
And he had his trusty camera with him, didn't he? Attempting to capture some images of the Earth.
A bit of early space photography.
How did that go?
Mixed results, I'm afraid.
That's a shame.
Some of the filtered images for the U.S. Weather Bureau turned out okay.
At least there was some success there.
But those conventional color photographs, well, they suffered from the same cloud cover that hampered the scientific observations.
Plus a few exposure issues, it seems.
Not the ideal conditions for photography.
But it was all part of the learning process, wasn't it?
Absolutely. They were constantly refining their techniques, figuring out what worked and what didn't.
And then right towards the end of his orbital stint, there was that rather unusual request.
Oh yes, that Spanish statement business.
It came out of the blue, didn't it?
Right near the end of the 5th orbit, just as he was starting to prepare for re-entry.
He was asked to deliver a message in Spanish.
Now, why would they ask him to do that?
It seems it was a public relations request.
A bit of an odd time to be thinking about PR, I'd say.
Schirra wasn't too pleased about it, understandably.
He was trying to focus on getting home safely. And here they were asking him to deliver a speech in another language.
But despite those distractions and the minor setbacks, The 6 orbits were deemed a success, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. They achieved what they set out to do.
They confirmed the spacecraft's capabilities and demonstrated that they could operate for an extended period.
And they used less fuel than expected, which was a bonus.
It was a significant boost for the Mercury program, even if the Soviets were still outpacing them in terms of endurance.
It was a step in the right direction, proof that they were making progress.
Now, let's turn our attention to Schirra himself.
The man at the helm of Sigma 7.
He wasn't just a passive passenger, was he?
No, not at all. He was an integral part of the mission, a skilled pilot who played a key role in its success.
His role in that technical evaluation was paramount.
He was instrumental in gathering that crucial data on the spacecraft's performance.
He executed all those tests with diligence and precision.
And his piloting skills were evident throughout the flight.
Particularly that fuel-efficient stabilization after separating from the Atlas booster.
That maneuver demonstrated his expertise as a pilot, his ability to conserve fuel while maintaining control of the spacecraft.
It set the tone for the entire mission, really.
It did. He was clearly a master of his craft.
And we've already touched upon the scientific aspects of the mission, which, unfortunately, were somewhat limited by those pesky clouds.
A reminder that even the best-laid plans can be thwarted by the winds of nature.
But Schirra's contributions on the engineering front more than made up for it.
He was a valuable asset to the team, providing crucial insights into the spacecraft's performance.
And let's not forget that overheating issue with his pressure suit.
A rather uncomfortable experience, I imagine.
He handled it like a true professional, though.
He did. He adjusted the suit's cooling system and modified his activities to manage the situation.
A testament to his resilience and his ability to adapt to unexpected challenges.
Astronauts need to be able to think on their feet, and Schirra certainly demonstrated that ability.
And his rather blunt assessment of the manual control system, sloppy, he called it, was quite telling.
It highlights the challenges they were still facing in those early days of spaceflight.
The technology was still in its infancy, and they were learning as they went.
It was a constant process of iteration and improvement.
And that Spanish statement request, well, that clearly wasn't appreciated.
It's understandable that he was frustrated by that, given the critical phase of the mission he was in.
He had more important things to focus on than public relations.
His priority was getting home safely, and rightly so.
But despite those frustrations, he brought Sigma 7 home with remarkable precision.
A perfect splashdown just half a mile from the recovery ship.
The USS Kearsarge.
An impressive feat of navigation.
It was a textbook re-entry and recovery.
A culmination of all their hard work and preparation.
And he even made an interesting observation after the flight regarding some bruising on his hand.
Bruising? From what?
It seems he'd got it from the hatch switch.
Ah, and that tied in with Grissom's Liberty Bell 7 incident, didn't it?
It did indeed. It lends some credence to the theory that Grissom might have accidentally triggered the explosive hatch on his flight.
Which had been a point of contention at the time.
Schirra's observation suggested that it was possible to inadvertently activate the hatch.
An interesting piece of the puzzle.
Now, for all the excitement of being in orbit, it seems Schirra wasn't particularly blown away by the view of Earth.
Really? That's surprising.
He likened it to high-altitude flights he'd experienced in his career as a pilot.
Perhaps the relatively low orbit of the Mercury flights didn't offer the same sense of perspective as later missions.
It's possible. Or maybe he was just a hard man to impress.
He was a seasoned pilot, after all. He'd seen a lot from the cockpit.
But he did have high praise for the Sigma 7 spacecraft itself.
Well, that's good to hear. It seems they built a good machine.
He ranked it highly among all the aircraft he'd flown.
High praise indeed, coming from a pilot of his caliber.
So a successful mission, both in terms of achieving its objectives and in Schirra's personal experience.
A significant step forward for the U.S. space program.
And yet, the public and political reaction was rather muted, wasn't it?
It was, overshadowed as it was by the unfolding Cuban Missile Crisis.
The world was on the brink of nuclear war, and a 6-orbit spaceflight suddenly seemed rather insignificant in comparison.
It's a stark reminder that even extraordinary achievements can be eclipsed by world events.
But Schirra's contributions were recognized, weren't they? He received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal.
A fitting tribute to his skill and professionalism.
And he was even approached about a possible career in politics.
Robert Kennedy, no less, inquired about his interest.
But Schirra declined, preferring to stick with his first love, flying.
A wise decision, perhaps. He was clearly a man who loved his chosen profession.
And of course, MA-8 served as a vital stepping stone towards that longer MA-9 mission.
They incorporated the lessons learned from MA-8 into the design and planning for MA-9.
making further weight-saving modifications to extend the spacecraft's endurance.
They were constantly pushing the boundaries, striving for greater achievements.
And the legacy of Sigma 7 lives on, doesn't it? It's currently on display at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex.
A tangible reminder of those pioneering days of human spaceflight.
A piece of history that visitors can marvel at and appreciate the ingenuity of those who designed and built it.
It's a testament to the human spirit of exploration and our desire to push beyond the limits of what's possible.
So, to sum it all up, MA8 was a crucial technical step forward for the U.S. in the space race.
It demonstrated their growing capability for extended orbital flight and boosted their confidence in their technology.
It wasn't about breaking endurance records, but about laying a solid foundation for future missions.
About refining their understanding of the challenges and complexities of operating in space.
And as we've noted, mission's achievements were somewhat overshadowed by the geopolitical events of the time.
A reminder that even the most extraordinary feats can sometimes be lost in the noise of world affairs.
But those who worked on MA8, and Schirra himself, deserve immense credit for their contributions.
They played a vital role in advancing the U.S. space program and paving the way for those iconic missions that followed.
So as a final thought for our listeners today, consider this. It's often those seemingly technical missions, the ones that don't grab the headlines, that are the most crucial.
The ones that lay the groundwork for the groundbreaking achievements that capture our imaginations.
They might not be as glamorous, but they're the unsung heroes of the space program.
The missions that test the technology, gather the data, and push the boundaries bit by bit.
So let's raise a glass to those unsung heroes, the engineers, the technicians, the flight controllers, and the astronauts like Walter Schirra,
who, through their dedication and hard work, made those giant leaps for mankind possible.
And let's not forget that even today, those seemingly small technical steps are being taken,
pushing the boundaries of what we know and what we can achieve.
Laying the foundation for those future missions that will inspire generations to come.
The journey continues, and it's built on the backs of those who dare to explore the unknown.
And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close.
Until next time, keep looking up at the stars.
And marveling at the wonders of human ingenuity.
And who knows what incredible feats we might witness in the years to come.
I, for one, can't wait to find out.
Nor I. It's an exciting time to be following space exploration, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The future is out there, waiting to be discovered.
Indeed. And who knows what wonders we might uncover.
Perhaps one day we'll even venture beyond our solar system.
Now that's a thought to ponder.
A tantalizing glimpse into the possibilities that lie ahead.
Until then, we can only dream and imagine.
And keep exploring the vastness of space, one mission at a time.
Quite right. Each mission, no matter how small, brings us one step closer to unraveling the mysteries of the cosmos.
And that's a journey worth taking, wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. A journey that will continue to inspire and amaze us for generations to come.
And with that, we bid you farewell for now.
Until our next deep dive into the annals of space exploration.
Goodbye and Godspeed.
All right then, time to dive in, and this one's quite something. Mercury Atlas 9.
MA9, as it's often called.
Exactly. Back in May '63, this wasn't just another hop into space, you know.
Oh, absolutely not. This marked the end, the very last crewed flight of Project Mercury.
America's first big push to get humans up there.
The culmination of it all.
And get this, as we sit here in 2025, Gordon Cooper, up in Faith 7, that's still the last time, the very last time an American astronaut went into orbit solo, alone.
Makes you think, doesn't it, with all the missions we've had since?
Quite a thought. And they were aiming for a near 24-hour flight. Ambitious, to say the least.
Oh, tremendously. You've got to remember the space race was really heating up.
Soviets already had longer solo flights under their belts with the Vostok program.
Each mission was a point scored, you see, a statement in that whole technological and ideological battle.
So for everyone listening, we're going to break down this pivotal mission.
You might have the broad strokes, but we're going into the nitty-gritty, the real challenges, the sheer ingenuity involved.
Exactly. By looking at what they wanted to achieve, how they went about it, and those inevitable hiccups along the way.
We can really get a feel for those early days of space exploration.
Now we've got a mountain's material for this one. Mission logs, post-flight reports, timelines, you name it. We've gone through it all, picked out the juiciest bits.
Fascinating stuff, really. You see this blend of wanting to push the limits, that ambition, but also having to work within the limitations of what they had.
Pragmatism.
Precisely. The Mercury spacecraft, that was first-generation technology, after all.
Right, so what exactly were they hoping to achieve with MA9?
Well, the main goals were pretty clear-cut. First and foremost, they wanted to test the Mercury spacecraft itself.
See how it would hold up for a longer mission.
Absolutely. And crucially, how a human being would cope during a prolonged solo flight in orbit.
Pushing towards that 24-hour mark.
Then, of course, there was the comparison with the Soviets.
They wanted to match, or at least get very close to, the duration of those Vostok flights.
Couldn't let them have all the glory.
And lastly, it wasn't all about just staying up there. They also had a whole bunch of scientific experiments lined up for Cooper to conduct.
The pace of development was remarkable, really, from Shepard's little suborbital hop to aiming for a full day in orbit.
In just a few years. Shows you the kind of commitment there was within the American space program.
Absolutely unwavering.
Now, to handle this extended flight, they had to tweak the standard Mercury capsule a bit.
Spacecraft number 20, which would become Faith 7, went through some quite significant modifications.
Oh, we'll talk about that name in a bit.
Indeed. To save weight, they actually removed the periscope.
Really? The periscope?
Yes, and a set of backup thrusters, too. In their place, they fitted extra batteries.
Makes sense.
And additional oxygen tanks. And naturally, all this extra kit meant Faith 7 ended up being a fair bit heavier.
Every gram counts when you're launching something into space.
It's a constant balancing act, isn't it? Capability versus weight versus reliability.
Each system you add for a longer flight, it adds complexity.
And with complexity comes the potential for things to go wrong. Removing the periscope, for example, it saved weight, but it also reduced the astronaut's ability to see what was going on outside directly.
Every decision had a knock-on effect.
A trade-off.
Now, it wasn't just the capsule that got a makeover. The Atlas booster, number 130D for this mission, had its own set of improvements. This was a more advanced version, featuring a hypergolic igniter in its upgraded propulsion system. Quite a big deal.
It was. This meant they didn't need that hold-down period at launch.
The one that caused some of those rough starts they had before.
Precisely. Apparently, getting rid of that 3-second hold-down also meant the booster could burn a little longer. Essentially, the hypergolic igniter made the rocket engines much more reliable.
So easier to start.
Imagine, flicking a light switch compared to a more complicated procedure.
Makes sense. Less chance of something going wrong.
The hypergolic igniter was a vital improvement. It simplified things and made the whole ignition sequence more reliable, which, let's face it, was essential with the Atlas's patchy history.
Right. So this new igniter allowed for a longer burn time, which also gave them a bit more leeway in reaching that crucial orbital velocity. Now, it wasn't all smooth sailing in the lead up to the launch. This particular Atlas booster, 130D, had a bit of a drama during its initial rollout at the factory.
Oh yes, they found some damaged wiring.
Had to take it back for repairs. But after a second rollout, the engineers over at Convair, they were feeling pretty good about it, calling it their best bird yet, apparently.
Confidence is key.
They'd even made some small tweaks based on what they'd learned from previous Atlas hiccups.
Always learning, always refining.
They added a liner to the turbopumps, for one, and they tidied up some of the wiring in the programmer, all aimed at making it as reliable as possible. Oh, and they slightly offset the booster actuators, too. Yeah. To avoid that roll issue they had during Shira's flight, MA8.
That iterative process, finding weaknesses and fixing them, that's the hallmark of good engineering.
Absolutely. Each launch, successful or not, it gave them valuable data to improve the hardware and the procedures.
And the fact that Convair felt this was their best booster yet, that says a lot about the progress they were making.
Oh, and then there's the name, Faith 7. Cooper chose it himself, showed his confidence in both the Atlas and the capsule.
Faith in his ride.
But a little tidbit for you. Word on the street is, some folks at NASA weren't too keen on it.
Really?
Shows you, even in the world of rockets and computers and all that, personal beliefs, even a bit of superstition, it still creeps in.
The human element, always present. Cooper's choice of name, it reflects that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So launch day finally arrived.
Yeah.
May 15th, 1963, Cape Canaveral.
The tension must have been incredible.
And Cooper delivers that iconic, very cool and calm report after cabin pressure sealed. Faith 7 is all go.
Goosebumps.
The Atlas performed beautifully on this flight. They actually got slightly more thrust than they expected from the engines. And there was a bit of propellant slosh, but nothing major. Cooper, once he was in orbit, didn't waste any time getting started on his tasks. One of the first things he did was try to track a xenon strobe beacon he'd ejected.
Like a little flashing light.
That's it. He couldn't find it on the first few orbits, but by the fourth, he managed to spot the little blinking thing.
Demonstrates the importance of good eyesight for an astronaut, doesn't it?
Yep.
And the feasibility of using those sorts of tracking techniques in orbit.
Absolutely. Even those seemingly small experiments, they all added to the growing body of knowledge about operating in space.
Building blocks.
He also tried to deploy a tethered balloon, bright orange, made of this tough, lightweight plastic film. The idea was to measure atmospheric drag. Unfortunately, that one didn't quite go to plan. It didn't eject properly, despite a few attempts. But a big milestone early on in the flight. By the seventh orbit, Cooper had already beaten Schirra's previous record for the longest American orbital flight.
Each time they extended the duration, it was a win in itself, pushing the limits of human endurance in space.
Absolutely. And surpassing Schirra's record, well, that showed they were on track to achieve that extended mission goal. Now, Cooper had a scheduled rest period later on, but he reported not feeling particularly sleepy. And this is where things get really interesting. He took some absolutely stunning photographs, images of Tibet, the Himalayas.
Wow.
What's particularly remarkable is that he reported seeing details on the ground, roads, even little villages.
Really?
Now, some people at the time might have been a bit skeptical.
Understandably.
But these observations were later confirmed by the Gemini crews, who flew higher and had better cameras.
It shows how our understanding of what's visible from orbit was constantly evolving. Cooper's observations, initially surprising, they gave valuable data about the potential for Earth observation from space, something that became hugely important in later missions and satellite programs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, he did have a few minor gripes. The food and water systems, well, they weren't exactly Michelin star quality. And he had a bit of trouble keeping a steady temperature in his suit. Apparently, it kept swinging between too hot and too cold.
Comfort is crucial, though, isn't it? Especially on a longer mission.
These little niggles highlight the challenges of designing life support systems that are truly reliable.
Especially for extended periods in the harsh environment of space.
Keeping a comfortable temperature and providing decent food, those are basic necessities for any astronaut.
Fundamental to their well-being and to the success of the mission.
Absolutely. But despite these minor annoyances, Cooper carried on with the science program. He attempted to photograph the zodiacal light and the night air glow. Those are faint glows in the night sky.
Tricky to capture.
The pictures ended up being a bit overexposed, but they still provided some useful data. And here's a real first. During his 17th orbit, as he passed over Cape Canaveral, Cooper transmitted the very first slow-scan black and white TV pictures from space by an American astronaut.
I read about that. Wasn't it a bit ghostly looking?
Apparently a rather spectral image of him, with his helmet and hoses visible. Still a genuine technological milestone.
Absolutely. This transmission was a huge step forward. It showed the potential for real-time communication from space, for sending visual data back to Earth. It paved the way for the live TV broadcasts that became so iconic in later missions, bringing the experience of spaceflight directly to people's living rooms.
Quite. Now, the later part of the flight is where things get a bit, shall we say, hairy. Starting around the 19th orbit, a series of technical glitches started cropping up. First, a warning light came on, suggesting he was about to re-enter the atmosphere.
When he was most definitely not.
Not at all. Then, on the 20th orbit, he lost all his attitude readings. Those are the systems that tell the spacecraft its orientation.
Vital for all sorts of things.
Power generation, thermal control, and most importantly, for that retrofire burn to get him back home.
A cascade of problems.
And then the big one. On the 21st orbit, a short circuit knocked out the main inverter. That, in turn, disabled the automatic stabilization and control system. Cooper was essentially flying a spacecraft that could no longer automatically maintain its orientation. And his reaction, things are beginning to stack up a little.
Remarkably calm under the circumstances.
Talk about keeping a cool head. So with all the automatic systems down, Cooper had to resort to more hands-on methods. He had to manually prepare for and execute the retrofire.
The burn to slow him down for re-entry.
That's it. And this is where the support from ground control became absolutely critical. In particular, John Glenn, who was on the tracking ship Coastal Sentry Quebec.
A fellow Mercury astronaut.
Exactly. Glenn taught Cooper through a revised checklist because many of the procedures that would normally be done automatically now had to be done by hand. Glenn, with his experience, he had a deep understanding of all the systems and procedures.
He was able to provide expert guidance to Cooper in a very tense situation. Real-time communication and the role of the ground support team, they were absolutely vital for keeping the mission safe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, Cooper had to manually align the spacecraft to this very precise angle, a 34-degree pitch down, for the retrofire. He'd actually drawn lines on the window beforehand.
Ingenious.
He used those, along with the stars, as visual guides to get the right orientation. And get this, he used his wristwatch to time the burn.
You're kidding.
His wristwatch. Imagine that. Glenn counted down 10 seconds, and Cooper fired those retro rockets right on his mark. Mark. Incredible piloting skill and resourcefulness.
It really shows the caliber of these early astronauts. They weren't just passengers. They were highly trained pilots, capable of taking over from those automated systems when things went wrong.
Now, remarkably, despite all this manual work, the splashdown was incredibly accurate. Just 4 miles from the USS Kearsarge, the recovery ship.
Talk about threading the needle.
It was the most precise landing of the whole Mercury program. After the flight, the doctors found Cooper was a bit dehydrated, and he had some lightheadedness from the blood pressure changes after being weightless for so long.
Orthostatic hypotension.
That's it, but nothing too serious after more than a day in orbit.
The accuracy of the landing, achieved entirely manually during such a critical phase, it's a testament to Cooper's skill.
And to the effectiveness of those manual procedures.
A fitting end to a mission that had thrown quite a few curveballs at them.
It really was. Now, MA9 being the final crewed Mercury flight, it brings us to the question of what next for the program. There was already a debate going on, even after Schirra's near-perfect MA8 flight. Some people, quite reasonably, thought they should wrap things up on a high note.
They'd pushed the Mercury hardware about as far as it could go.
Time to focus on the more advanced Gemini program.
The next step.
But the opposing view, and the one that won out for MA9, was that the Mercury team deserved a shot at that near 24-hour flight, especially since the Soviets had already done it.
That competitive spirit, it was a powerful driver.
Securing that longer flight with MA9 essentially brought the Mercury program level with Soviet capabilities in terms of solo mission duration. This whole debate, it reflects that constant tension between playing it safe and the urge to push boundaries in any kind of pioneering endeavor.
Absolutely. The Mercury program had achieved so much, but the hardware was, at its core, first generation. It had limitations. And the desire to match the Soviets, particularly in the context of the space race, well, that was a huge motivator.
And the success of ME9, achieving that extended duration despite all those technical issues, it really solidified the feeling that Mercury had done what it set out to do. They even considered a Mercury Atlas 10 mission.
A 3-day flight?
Ambitious.
It was. But ultimately, NASA decided it was time to move on to Project Gemini.
So MA10 never flew.
A strategic shift. The Mercury program had laid the groundwork. It was time to move on to bigger and better things.
Right. Gemini offered more capabilities. Longer missions, spacewalks, rendezvous, all essential stepping stones towards Apollo and landing on the moon. So to recap, Mercury Atlas 9 wasn't just the last crewed Mercury mission. It remains, to this day, the last time an American astronaut went into orbit alone. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. It was a real testament to how far they'd pushed the Mercury spacecraft and to the skill and resilience of Gordon Cooper. And of course, it laid the foundation for Gemini and Apollo. The experience they gained, the confidence they built, it was invaluable. Oh, and the Faith 7 capsule itself, it's on display at Space Center Houston in Texas.
A museum piece now, a reminder of a pivotal moment in space history.
A tangible link to those pioneering days.
MA9 reminds us of that incredible spirit of the early space program. The risks they took, pushing the boundaries of both technology and human endurance, and it shows what can be achieved with careful planning, rigorous training, and the ability to adapt and overcome unexpected challenges.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into MA9, we've seen a successful extended duration flight, pushing the Mercury capsule to its limits. We've looked at those scientific experiments, some more successful than others, but all adding to our understanding. And of course, those dramatic technical malfunctions towards the end of the flight and Gordon Cooper's masterful piloting to bring Faith 7 home safely.
It encapsulates the enormous progress they made in spacecraft technology, but also the enduring importance of human skill and ingenuity when things get tough.
So something for you to ponder, dear listeners. Consider the level of risk, the uncertainty that was just part and parcel of those early space flights. How did individuals like Gordon Cooper and the whole ground support team, how did they manage to mitigate those very real dangers? And what does it tell us about that human need to explore, to venture into the unknown, even when we're faced with significant limitations?
It makes us think about the interplay between technological advancement and human capability. Technology gives us the tools, but often it's the adaptability, the problem-solving skills of individuals that make the difference when things go wrong.
If this deep dive has sparked your interest, and I hope it has, I'd encourage you to delve deeper into the Mercury program. There's a wealth of information out there. It's a truly fascinating period in human history.
Understanding those early days, the foundations laid by Mercury, it's essential for appreciating how far we've come since then. It's a story of ambition, of innovation, of daring to venture into the unknown.
Absolutely. These deep dives into space exploration history, they're not just about looking back. They're about understanding our journey so far, and perhaps getting a glimpse of where we might be headed next.
And who knows what wonders we might uncover along the way.